The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
The official offseason of Fantasy NBA Today starts today, and the reason that that's the case is because the schedule changes a little bit. Welcome to the show. I'm Dan Besbris. You guys know that. But here's the good news. The bad news is that there aren't NBA regular season games happening right now, so your fantasy leagues are all over. We got playoff basketball. That's part of the good news. The other good news is that in the offseason, I actually get to talk to other people, which is really exciting for me. And Mondays, you're stuck with me, but you're also blessed with the wonderful Ethan Norof. Ethan, happy to have you along. Mondays, co-hosts. This is a lovely thing. Good morning to you.
Well, good morning. What better way to start the week, right? A little sunshine, a little Ethan. I think my students would probably respond the same way.
Yeah, I hope so. So before we were going on air, here's the thing. I mean, I got all these things I want to talk about at the beginning of the show, just logistical stuff, but I don't want to bore people with that. Ethan and I were talking about basketball shorts before we went on air. So at some point during today's podcast, I'm going to bug you about that again, and I'm expecting the same level of energy on air that I got from you off.
I can deliver that, and I promise you that when we talk about athleisure and what it means in my life, there is nothing short of a passionate stance coming forward.
I love the term athleisure. You know, I hadn't actually heard that before, which probably tells you that I have, I think, 0 athleisure items in my closet.
Here's the thing for me is that, some people want to reference it as athletic wear, but that's all fine and good if you're actually using it for, athletics. I tend to use it more for style and going grocery shopping and things of that nature, because the stuff I wear to the gym are clothes that I've had for a decade plus that I wouldn't wear anywhere in public besides the gym. But, those basketball shorts that, you find the good deal at TJ Maxx, Marshalls, Macy's, Ross, wherever it's got to be, and you want to flaunt that a little bit as summertime comes up. Yeah, that's out in public, baby. We got this.
He is at Ethan_Norof on Twitter. If you're not already following my good man here, I am at Dan Besbris. This is Fantasy NBA Today, a hoop ball presentation. Also brought to you by our good friends over at Hawaiian Isles Kona Coffee Company. Ethan, we got to get you hooked on that stuff. Are you a coffee man?
I am a coffee man. As a teacher, especially, I'm a coffee man. And funny enough, I was speaking to my wife about the sponsorship that we're fortunate enough to have here. And she mentioned that one of her best friends, actually one of the ladies that she does hair and makeup with, is a big-time fan of the product and has been for quite some time.
Awesome. There we go. See, that's what keeps happening, too. And I know that's what went on with Brewski when he found out about the blossoming partnership, is that he was like, this is the coffee that my wife and I, when we go to the market, and that's our special coffee, and now they're partners with us at Hoop Ball. This is amazing. So thank you to our good friends at Hawaiian Isles, at HI Kona Coffee on Twitter. HawaiianIsles.com is the website. You can also search for them on Amazon.com. Just put in Hawaiian Isles in the search box. It pops right up. You can get that sucker sent to your doorstep. Prime. So the offseason, Ethan, of course, is all about, the beginning at least, kind of a reflective nature, looking back on a season gone by, lessons learned, things of that nature, things that we can take away from just from a reality standpoint and how that might even impact fantasy teams, but also, obviously, fantasy lessons learned. So, I got into a little bit of it on Friday with Brew. A lot of my stuff revolves around categories, so I'll save that for later in the show. What is one of your top lessons learned from this most recent season gone by? I want to dig into this thing, a nice deep dive here on a Monday.
Yeah, I think one of my biggest lessons learned from this season, before we get into the fantasy stuff, we'll dabble in reality a little bit. And it's that the Clippers are really setting themselves up for a future by sort of detaching themselves from the past. And, we saw that process start to play out when Chris Paul, the decision to move on from Chris Paul was made, decision to move on from Blake Griffin was made. And, for a while, the Clippers felt like they were chasing the lure of the Lakers. Even though the Lakers hadn't been successful in recent seasons, they were chasing that Lakers lure, the battle for LA, all that stuff. And, over the last year or especially 2 years, they've gotten away from that. And they've just built their own identity. And, they've never really had an identity before. And now they do. And, you have a team of guys right now who ironically, it feels like Doc Rivers is the perfect coach for this rebuild. I mean, he spent so much of his career trying to escape the rebuild, right, and only coach teams that he thought would be contending. And that's actually the reason why he found himself in Los Angeles, is he didn't want to do the rebuild with Boston. Well, I think that's worked out pretty well. And it feels like the Clippers are on a similar path. You know, when they traded Chris Paul, people were like, oh, my God, they lost Chris Paul. And they traded him for spare parts. They didn't really get anything for him. Well, Patrick Beverley, Lou Williams, Montrezl Harrell, you look back on that, that sure isn't nothing these days. Those are all key pieces for them as they move forward. And then when you look back on the Blake Griffin trade, you know, everyone said, you know, you just re-signed him. Like, what are you doing moving on from him? Are you sort of admitting that this wasn't a move we should have made? And, you know, with Blake Griffin sitting out what feels like it's going to be the first round of the playoffs, and probably watch Detroit's season end without him active. You know, you look up and down this Clippers roster, and you know, nobody really stands out in terms of star power, but they've got a bunch of guys who play hard, they play well together, and they're setting themselves up to be quite a big player at the poker table this summer. The Tobias Harris trade was definitely a surprise, but positioned themselves well. And I think Kevin Durant has complimented this team twice in the last week alone. And, you know, I think it could be very interesting to see Kevin Durant and Kawhi Leonard wearing Clippers uniforms next year. I'm not saying, but I'm just saying, you know?
Yeah, the one that, you know, I was going to bring up the Tobias Harris thing, too, is that, you know, he was the guy that they got basically in that Blake Griffin deal. He seemed like such a great fit, and then they moved on from him as well. That was, I mean, those are hard moves to make. The fact that they were able to continue winning basketball games after all of that really, to me, kind of softened the blow on the fan base, where if they went from being good to just being unwatchable, I think you would have seen a much larger backlash, right?
Yeah, I think so. And, you know, they've done a good job in sort of filling in the complementary pieces as they're waiting for the main dish to arrive. You know, you got guys like, whether it's the drafting of SGA, whether it's the sneaky acquisition of a guy like Landry Shamet in that same Tobias Harris deal, or guys who just play hard like JaMychal Green and Montrezl Harrell. You know, the Clippers, I mean, we won't even talk about the Ivica Zubats for Mike Muscala gifts from the Lakers. You know, at the time, I kind of sat here, and as somebody who, you know, has followed the Lakers since before I cared to date myself, since before Kobe's rookie season.
So the Sedale Threat era, I believe, is what you're referring to?
I remember Cedric Ceballos in a Lakers jersey. Let's just And, you know, you looked at that trade and you said objectively, okay, well, Zubats is a guy they're probably not re-signing anyway, so if you move him to the Clippers for a player in Mike Muscala, who at least in theory fits this roster a little bit better, he's more of a stretch five if you want to call him a center. But then he just didn't play. The Lakers didn't play Muscala. And it's not like Zubats came in and sort of set the Clippers' world aflame. But you look back at that trade and you just say, why? It doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. So I think the Clippers almost got a little bit bailed out by that too, because they were looking for an answer inside, and clearly Marcin Gortat was not that. And Montrezl Harrell has been so good in his off-the-bench six-man role. And, you know, it feels like Lou Williams is going to collect yet another six-man of the year, and how could anyone vote against him? And I get that. But when's the last time you had a team who had two legitimate six-man of the year candidates in Montrezl Harrell and Lou Williams on the same roster? And really, in a different year, Harrell could contend for both six-man of the year and most improved. But it feels like Lou's going to get six-man, and Pascal Siakam locked up that most improved a long time ago.
Yeah, Clippers are really, I mean, listen, I wanna hate him, but I can't. Patrick Beverley, he changes their team. To me, he was the reason that they were so good in the second half, that he got healthy and he sort of went back to being that insane energy Patrick Beverley that we've seen in seasons gone by. I don't have his contract status in front of me. Is he a free agent after this year, or can they bring him back?
He is a free agent after the year, and I think he's one of those players they will look to bring back, whether you look at him or a guy like Lou Williams. And I keep saying Lou's name, but I mean, between those two guys this year, you're talking about $13 million allocated. So in a league where Danilo Gallinari is getting paid nearly $22 million, I consider that a pretty good value. And you know, those types of guys, they tend to get overlooked, underappreciated, kind of designated however you want in that same sphere. But those are the kind of guys that really shape the chemistry and the camaraderie of a locker room and set the tone for how a team is going to play, a certain style, a certain standard, if you will. And I think for this young team who with the roster having as many young guys as they do, they need that. And moving forward, if you can add a couple of big names to this mix and, really make it interesting in addition to some of their draft assets, I think the Clippers are going to be in a really good spot and a better team than people had anticipated, kind of like what we saw this year. I mean, no one saw the Clippers in the playoffs this year. It wasn't even a discussion.
Do you think it's very Billy Bean-like, to use a baseball analogy, the way the Clippers were able to kind of move on before people thought they were going to move on? Are there any other teams that jump into your head as clubs that could make a similar move and just trying to kind of get ahead of the curve a little bit? So, we're not going to get over the hump. We could try to grind this thing out for another year or two, but maybe we ought to just blow it up and start over now. Are there any teams that jump out at you as spots where maybe that's the way they ought to go, as opposed to continuing to push this direction? The one that pops into my head is the Spurs. Yeah,
I think the Spurs are a good example of that. I think, we kind of saw that with Brooklyn a little bit, although their build was more methodical. But in terms of arriving before anyone expected them to, I think we saw that this year with them making the playoffs. I'm very interested to see what the Hawks do, because Atlanta now has, a couple of really good pieces, and Trae Young and John Collins. And, I'm curious to see if they want to expedite that timetable at all in an Eastern Conference where the last three seeds who made the playoffs were basically 500, 42-40 on two of them, and 41-41 on the eighth seed. So I think Atlanta could be an interesting team in that regard. And I think Sacramento, with the success that they had this year, I know they wound up missing the playoffs, obviously, but now that they've got Luke Walton as their head coach, and it seems like he's taking over a roster that he thought he'd be taking over with the Lakers last year, obviously, before the big sign. And I think that'll be a better fit for him. And so I think the Kings are one of those teams that, kind of like when they signed Nemanja Bjelica last year in free agency after all that back and forth, where he said, that's kind of a weird signing for a rebuilding team. And then the season started, you're like, the Kings might not be rebuilding. They might actually have already been building something. And, granted, Harrison Barnes cost them absolutely nothing in terms of Zach Randolph and Justin Jackson. I mean, not even a pick swap on that deal. So I think they've started to take some of those first steps or initial steps toward relevancy. And I could see the Kings being that much more aggressive this summer, because they see Buddy Hield, they see De'Aaron Fox, they see Harry Giles, they see some of the fruits of their labors. Marvin Bagley obviously having a better rookie season than I think a lot of people anticipated. So there are some up and coming teams that I think could fit that bill.
From a fantasy standpoint, turning the clock on our conversation back to the Clippers stuff again, if Patrick Beverley ends up back with the Clippers, I think we have a pretty good idea of what his role is. He could end up in a lot of different places. I would think that there would be at least a few suitors for someone that plays like he does. And as a point of reference, and I don't know if people realize this, because he doesn't score very much, but over the last 3 months of this year, he was actually the number 60 guy in 9 category formats, 8.7 points. Yeah, he did it under 9 points a game, but 6.3 rebounds, 4.5 assists, 1.2 steals, 1.7 3-pointers, 0.7 blocks from your point guard as well, and only 1 turnover a game. He's a guy that I would absolutely be targeting in that 90 to 100 range, thinking he probably might even fall farther than that. You just have to hope he's not signed to be someone's backup. He doesn't strike me as someone that's going to sign in a place where he would be someone's backup.
Yeah, I think he's got to – I think if that were to happen, he's got to go to a situation where he thinks he's going to contend for a title. And the Clippers could very well be in that mix, assuming they get at least one of the larger names on the free agent market. So I agree with you. I don't think he's going to go, let me go back to my Washington, or let me go to Washington. Let me kind of fill in the gap until if and when John Wall gets back on the court and set myself up for a new deal next summer. Like, he doesn't strike me as that profile of a player, especially at this stage of his career. And I think Beverly takes a certain pride in being the underdog, whether that's from an individual standpoint or from a team standpoint. And I think he's, when you have, and this is the human element that I can't seem to quantify with a formula or an algorithm, and so let me try to articulate it through words, is that when you have a guy, a player, and he's been searching to be part of something larger. Beverly was one of those guys who was kind of, he's all right, but we're going to move on from him in a number of situations. And so he's used to getting the short end of the stick. And so when you finally build kind of like the Nets built this year, they built this team of cast-offs or this team of misfits, kind of like the broken toy island. And I think the Clippers are trying to take a similar approach with these guys and saying, hey, you weren't good enough here, you weren't good enough there, but you're more than good enough for us, and you're part of our community, you're part of our identity, you're part of who we are. You get guys to buy in that much more. And I think with Pat Beverly, that's the sense of ownership that he's enjoying with the Clippers, is they've given him an opportunity that so many others just seemingly didn't, because of contractual status, because of contractual guarantees or whatever it might have been. And, Pat Bev was one of those guys who's, his draft rights were sold. He was traded a few times. He was cut a couple of times. And now he's at a place where, hey, I feel like I'm part of something. And when you feel that way as a human, this is what separates us as humans from a lot of other animals, is that you tend to try that much harder. When you feel appreciated, you want to give that much more of an effort on a daily basis and over the long term. So I think that's what you're starting to see, or what you have seen, I should say, with Beverly, and especially and some of those other guys on that team. Lou Williams, another guy who's bounced around, and Montrezl Harrell playing that much harder now that he's seen as an integral piece instead of a complementary one. So I think that culture that the Clippers have been able to create as a result, that's something that should be preserved and valued, because I think it's been an asset for their growth.
Can I give you points for the Island of Misfit Toys reference earlier in that synopsis? I love that. That's what we called ourselves when we worked in Bakersfield, basically. We just referred to our staff as the Island of Misfit Toys. So I'm well aware of it. Very strange film. Folks can go out. I think that came out like right around the turn of the millennium, if I'm not mistaken. What about the Lakers then? Since we talked very briefly about what's going on there, reality, fantasy, whatever you want to get into here. Last thing I heard was that all of a sudden now Jimmy Butler is being linked to the Lakers a bunch, which feels like a pretty weird big target for them to go for, considering, LeBron and the fact that Jimmy's had some issues getting along with his teammates in the past. I don't know. I mean, it would make for good theater, if nothing else. You think anybody ends up on the Lakers? You think they sign a free agent this offseason? I think they get somebody.
I do think the Lakers wind up with someone, whether it is through free agency and or through trade. But that's exactly my criticism with the Lakers, is this has been the plan for too long. We're going to wind up with somebody next to LeBron. It could be Anthony Davis. It could be Klay Thompson. It could be Jimmy Butler. It could be this. It could be that. It might just be Brian Windhorst as he continues to cover LeBron at every stage of his career. The whole point being that there seems to be an absence of a true plan, of a true direction, of a true vision. And even in the event of failure, you want to see this team commit to an identity, commit to a vision, commit to something. They seem to be in limbo for far too long, since probably before Kobe retired at this point.
Yeah.
And you're looking at just the contractual status of this roster. I mean, going into next year, you have Rajon Rondo as a free agent. KCP is a free agent. Lance Stevenson, Reggie Bullock, Mike Muscala is a free agent. JaVale McGee, Tyson Chandler, both free agents. So you're talking about literally half the roster turning over and turning into free agency, with only Lonzo Ball, assuming he's still on the team if he's not traded, Isaac Bonga, who people still don't know what he even looks like, Josh Hart, Brandon Ingram coming off of what I would consider a major surgery. I mean, I don't think he's a certainty. I don't think he's a question mark, but I don't think he's a certainty coming off of that surgery.
Yeah.
And Kyle Kuzma as their key contributors. And with all due respect to Mo Wagner, he really didn't show anything this particular season. So when you kind of look around and you see, okay, the Lakers have LeBron James and a bunch of question marks, this is exactly the position that the team was in last summer after signing LeBron James. So I think whether it's an Anthony Davis trade, whether it's chasing Klay Thompson, whether it's trying to pursue Jimmy Butler, Tobias Harris, or any other of those big names out there, I think the Lakers need to really sit down as a whole now that Magic Johnson's out of the picture, and that's a whole different conversation in and of itself, and decide what their vision is going to be. Because just having LeBron at this point in his career isn't enough. You need to surround him with something real. This isn't LeBron a decade ago. This is LeBron at 30 in life after 35. And so when you sit down and try to plan, okay, my future is going to include this or my future is going to include that, you really have to be cognizant of the fact that LeBron James is no longer the most dominant player in the NBA. Not this season anyway. And so when you think about it like that, you have to think about your complementary pieces as being more than ifs, being more than hypotheticals. So yes, if Kyle Kuzma can be more than a scorer. If Brandon Ingram can take that next step, which he started to just before he got hurt, which made the injury that much worse. So if Brandon Ingram can take the next step, if Lonzo Ball becomes the point guard the Lakers drafted him to be, but too many ifs from key contributors, too many ifs from guys who are expected to be guarantees. And I think that in-between game is a bad place to be in life, and it's a really bad place to be in the NBA, especially as the Western Conference has at least 9 or 10 teams that you can sit here and say, oh, that team is ahead of the Lakers right now because of actual achievement or because of opportunities that they're going to have in front of them, or both. I mean, remember, you've got teams like Minnesota, Sacramento, and really New Orleans, depending on how the Anthony Davis saga shakes out, that didn't finish in the playoffs that you could argue might be ahead of the Lakers for reason X or reason Y. So when you're the Lakers and you're talking about returning to the playoffs, I mean, it's a steep hill to climb, to say the least. And right now, you're racing the clock with LeBron under contract.
Yeah, hell, plus you could almost throw the Mavericks in there, too, with a healthy Kristaps Porzingis and a second-year Luka Doncic. That's a team that should potentially make a pretty good leap forward as well. From a fantasy standpoint, and by the way, this is Mondays, man. Get used to it. This is going to be great. Dan Besbris, Ethan Norof, carting you through the offseason here. I'll give you the rest of the weekly schedule at the end of today's show. From a fantasy standpoint, Ethan, how does this all tie in for you? What did this mean for your 2018-2019 season? What was something you took away, whether it's because of all the weird stuff, all of the sort of these teams in purgatory, teams making moves ahead of time? Did that tie into how your fantasy team played out, or was it kind of a different direction for you?
I think the biggest takeaway for me from this season was really just draft the guys that you believe in. At the end of the day, you don't want to miss out on a guy because you think it might be too early to take him, or because you might think you can snag him in the next round, and you become trying to get a value play instead of going after the guys that you want. At the end of the day, you still got to want to root for the guys on your roster. And I'm not saying to draft all your favorite players, or, if you're a Pelicans fan, take straight Pelicans because then you want to light your hair on fire. Definitely don't do that. But what I am saying is that you want to have an investment in a team that you believe in. So, let's use Brandon Ingram as a good example of this. Now, obviously, Brandon Ingram did not work out for me this year on my teams, in large part because of the injury and in some part because of some underwhelming performance to begin the year. But when Brandon Ingram showed that he was turning the corner in the second half before he did go down for the season, that was a huge point of validation for me personally, and for anyone who believed in the Brandon Ingram growth story, because he was becoming the player that so many had believed he would be. And for me, I'd rather draft Brandon Ingram around early than try to sit on him for a round later and miss him by 2 picks. So that's just one example of that. But I think in fantasy, we tend to see a lot of groupthink, right? We see this with first-round picks primarily, and we also see it with sleepers, because no matter what fantasy sport you're playing, especially basketball, we all tend to come out at the same time and say, okay, here are our sleepers for this year. Make sure you don't forget about this guy. Make sure you don't forget about this guy. Make sure you don't forget about this guy.
Yeah, then they're not sleepers anymore, right? Once they're awake, they're not a sleeper.
Right. They're not a sleeper. And you have this groupthink, this buy-in happening where, oh, this guy's going to be amazing. Okay. The groupthink phenomenon, for me, the clearest example of it this year was Jared Allen. Right? Jared Allen was catapulted up to be like a 3rd or 4th round pick in a lot of spots. And I'm sitting here in mock drafts and even into drafting season going, man, that's kind of high for all these other names that are on the board that are proven commodities that I know are going to deliver. Jared Allen might deliver me this, or he might deliver me that. But if everybody's thinking he's going to be this, then there's going to be some of that natural competition to be the guy who actually lands him, regardless of how he performs. So, Jared Allen was getting drafted ahead of Nikola Vucevic in a majority of leagues that I was in. Now, looking back on that, would anyone have made that same decision? I don't think so. But at that time, Nikola Vucevic, well, his role is going to be marginalized. Mo Bamba's coming in. The Magic are rebuilding. They might trade him, blah, blah, blah. And sure enough, none of that winds up happening. The Magic are in the playoffs. Vucevic has an all-star season. And you're sitting here going, did I mess up as a result of somebody else's thought process? So be committed to your own individual evaluation and the investment. Be cognizant of what other people are saying, but don't commit yourself to that groupthink ideology, and don't be trapped in that process. Otherwise, you wind up building a compromised team.
Yeah, there were a lot of guys, Ethan, that were drafted in that same bucket. I like to call things buckets, I guess, so I'll just roll with that on this one. The bucket of centers that went off the board kind of between like 30 and 50, I thought was a really interesting one this last season, and I'll see if I can name them all. DeAndre Ayton was definitely in there. Jared Allen, who you just mentioned, Draymond Green, Miles Turner, Marc Gasol, Blake Griffin, Al Horford, Nick Vucevic, John Collins. I feel like that might be all of the ones. Then you move into another bucket. Then the next bucket comes along, and that's like the Whiteside Valanciunas bucket after that first one. But that was a lot of names in there that guys were drafting, and a lot of them you felt like you were looking at it, you're like, okay, well, Jared Allen, there's one where you're thinking, we've seen this guy do it in like 20 minutes a game, but we don't really know what his role is going to be. Miles Turner was coming off a down season. There was an opportunity there perhaps to get him a little later than expected. We didn't really know what to make of Marc Gasol. What was Blake Griffin going to do? To his credit, by the way, Blake played better this year. He got a little closer to the rim, and his percentages improved. But there were so many centers in there, and I would argue that Ayton, Allen, and John Collins were in a serious hype train issue going into this last draft season.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, too, you mean a guy like Yusuf Nurkic, obviously he wound up getting hurt toward the end of the year, but even a guy like that was in that second tier of centers a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Closer to his now teammate and his Cantor than to a Nick Vucevic or to a Jarrett Allen. And I think a lot of fans, a lot of fantasy players, a lot of even some analysts will get caught up in this game of, oh, well, he did this in 15 to 18 minutes per night, or, oh, he did this in 20 to 25 minutes per night. Now he's going to go into a starting role. Now he's going to play 30 minutes a night. Now his per 36 numbers are going to be this, this, and this. And you get into this dangerous game of projection and extrapolation when in reality that doesn't always happen that way. Jared Allen's rookie season, there was a lot to take away from that and said, oh, this guy could be better if he gets more minutes, or, oh, he's shown that he has the skill to do X or Y. Well, the reality is Jared Allen's minutes, yeah, they did go up. They went up by about 6 per game, but his percentages, well, they stayed the same. Field goal percentage stayed the same. 3-point percentage take a step back. Free throw percentage a step back. So the rebounds and the points went up. The blocks went up just by a little bit. But it's not this extrapolation. It's kind of like when people talk about Boban, right? When Boban has 10 points and 8 rebounds in 12 minutes, they're like, oh, my God, he's averaging 30 and 24 per 36. Yeah, but also no. Like, it doesn't quite work that way. And when you have a guy who's playing the majority of his minutes against competition that may be subpar, second units, third units, all these contextual items that don't get factored into the formula or to the algorithm, these are still pieces of the puzzle. This is why it drives me crazy when people try to solely rely on narratives, try to solely rely on numbers, try to solely rely on X or solely rely on Y. It has to be a marriage of all this information together. It can't just be, well, I'm going to choose the numbers because that's what I believe in. I'm going to choose the narratives because that's what I believe in. You have to consider everything and try to make the best decision possible as a result of that. And I'm not here to knock analytics. I'm not here to knock scouting. No. I'm just here to understand that there are a variety of ways to consume information. And when you catapult one above the other, well, there may be this ability, or there may be this chance that you're losing something in the process as a result.
Yeah, I don't think anybody was taking that as a knock on numbers or analytics or anything of that note. I mean, the way I interpreted what you were saying, which is like, this is a starting point. You can say, hey, this guy has a really good fantasy profile, and that's awesome. We have to figure out what that means if he gets more playing time, if he steps into greater responsibility. And for a lot of these young guys, there's actually a little bit of a dip before they come back and figure it out again. It might be that next year turns out to be the year that Jared Allen goes huge, right? Like we saw kind of a similar thing from a Miles Turner who looked great in 2 years ago, or I guess it'd be almost like 3 years ago now, and then had kind of a step back year where he tried to take on a bigger role. He tried to take on more responsibility, ended up getting hurt more often because of the larger minute load. There was some bad luck in there as well. And then it was actually this most recent season where Miles Turner took that giant leap forward after like a weird first month of the year. Jared Allen, he had that great ending to his rookie year, and we looked at it and we were like, well, there's a way that he could project inside the top 40, but a lot of things have to break his direction. They didn't all break his direction. This is a team that actually brought in some veterans like an Ed Davis that could chew into his playing time. They could go small, and that would chew into his playing time. And until he sort of becomes that force that basically says, I'm going to be on the floor, and you have to keep me on the floor, there are those little red flags. And now we don't mean to be picking on Jared Allen. He's just the example that came up. So I guess maybe now looking ahead, Ethan, is there anybody that pops into your mind as someone that maybe we saw a strong finish to the year or some big permanent numbers that you think is going to get drafted a little bit too soon next year? I mean, I know a guy on the top of my head, and I'm probably going to fall for it. And those are guys like Jaren Jackson Jr. and Mitchell Robinson, who we saw go crazy in limited time, but we don't really know what next year brings. I worry those guys are going to get overdrafted next year.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely an element of that. You know, we call that the recency bias. You know, what you saw last will tend to be what you remember. And so I think there will be candidates who fall into that bucket for sure. I can't think of any off the top of my head for me besides guys who I've had kind of floating for a while. I mean, I think of a guy like, you know, Ben Simmons, a guy like Luka Doncic, who they both have a lot of hype behind them for different reasons, you know, especially Doncic this year being his rookie year. Simmons a little bit quieter this year just because we kind of saw it last year and we knew what to expect, but still quite a bit of hype behind him. And I think the return that those guys give you just from the efficiency standpoint and from the fact that Ben Simmons refuses to grow his game at all in any capacity, I think they're going to be overdrafted. I think Simmons is going to be a second round pick in most leagues.
Yikes.
And to me, he's not worth a pick before round 5 at the earliest. And Doncic is going to find himself in similar territory where, you know, he's going to be maybe a second round pick, but probably won't last beyond the 3rd, definitely not the 4th. And based on the numbers, I mean, you're talking about that efficiency is just such a drain with the volume. Maybe things get a little bit better in that regard because Porzingis will be back next year, but that's still, you know, an uncertainty. And it's not like Doncic is suddenly going to take half the amount of shots. So I think he's a guy who's going to get overdrafted. And when you look at guys like that, you try to be playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. So instead of being reactive, being proactive and trying to project who the next person to fit in that category might be. D'Angelo Russell, you know, was drafted at a discount last year. He wound up being obviously a major steal for anyone who believed in what he brought to the table. And I think you have some guys this year who dependent upon where they might land in free agency and or how the offseason sort of determines where they're going to go, then they're going to have a change in value as well. I mean, DeMarcus Cousins is a guy who was sort of an afterthought in a lot of drafts and maybe a stash toward the back, but that's it. Now that he's, you know, kind of shown that he's healthy enough anyway, I mean, I find it hard to believe that he'll be back with the Warriors for a second straight year. So if he goes and signs with the team that's going to make him their frontline center, and you're talking about, you know, the old DeMarcus Cousins being back in terms of numbers and production, that's another guy who gets catapulted to the front who wasn't there last year. So I think there are always guys you can kind of slide in and slide out, and guys who are overlooked or forgotten as a result of that. And then you move forward from there. Like I think a guy like Otto Porter Jr. is probably going to be undervalued in a lot of drafts next year.
Totally agree. Yeah, and you know, we were talking about the Lakers earlier in the show. There's a chance that Boogie ends up in L.A. You know, what if you throw him alongside LeBron James? They probably expect him to shoot some more three-pointers. Not great for his field goal percent, but that would be an interesting landing spot. And yeah, I agree with you. I don't think the Warriors could afford to bring him back at full strength. He's going to ask for, I don't know if he's going to command, but he's going to certainly ask for a larger salary. I think we can probably put a pin in this for now. I mean, we've got a whole offseason of Monday shows, Ethan, so no reason to blow through all of our sweet, sweet info on night number 1, right?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, and the fact that we didn't really get into the athleisure conversation, I mean, I think that just
I forgot. I totally forgot. I'm ashamed. All right, we'll save that one for next week, I guess.
We'll save it for next week, and we'll hit the people with a tease, which is what we'll simply say. If you're not familiar with the term athleisure, I mean, get familiar with it. We are in an age where fashion values leggings for women, joggers for men, and you can wear them to the club. You could wear them out to dinner. You could wear them if you're going to the grocery store. This is the time I was meant to be alive. You know how some people sit here and say, oh, I should have been born in the 60s. I should have been born in the 90s. I should have been born in the 20s. No, everyone, this is my time. Enjoy it. We're all in this together.
This is Ethan's time. I live in West LA, so land of the yoga pants. I feel like I'm sort of knee deep in it, and I generally am not. I dress more like I still live in like the East Bay, which is like jeans and a hoodie no matter what the weather is. So I'm a confused man most of the time. So we'll talk more about athleisure. I have to familiarize myself with it on next Monday's show. We'll get into some more lessons learned from a season gone by. He is Ethan Norof, the marvelous Ethan Norof. I got to come up with some good assonance is the term, I think, right? When you got you get the word starting with the same letter, but it's vowels. So the electrifying Ethan Norof. There's our assonance for the day.
Yeah, that's good. We like that. The electric, the electrifying, the I would say elastic in terms of sweatpants, but that seems kind of like an odd nickname to give myself.
The elastic sweatbanded Ethan Norof is co-host of all of our Monday shows.
That paints a picture I'm not sure I'm comfortable with everyone.
Well,
I don't buy that.
It's certainly not athleisure, but it is comfortable. I'll give you that. I am Dan Besbris. This is Fantasy NBA Today. Rest of the week schedule, I'll be with Neil Rochlani tomorrow. We're talking gambling a lot of Tuesdays here during the offseason. That should be a lot of fun. Brandon Marcus will join me on Wednesdays. Thursday, it'll be Adrian and a rotating co-host. Friday, Neil and a rotating co-host as well. It's going to be a lot of fun. We got great shows for the offseason. We're going to cover all of the teams. We're going to do lessons learned from all of the voices that I just described. We're going to go through at some point and look at how close all of the pre-rankings were from the big box websites to where guys actually ended up. I think that's a really good tool because a lot of us end up drafting sort of almost subconsciously based on where the pre-ranks have guys, and knowing how close those actually are is really good for knowing where you should reach a little bit in coming years. Have a wonderful Monday, everybody. Again, playoff basketball continues. We'll talk a little more gambling on that front on tomorrow's podcast. For Ethan, I'm Dan. We'll talk to you then.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.